going to jump in. Something that I missed from chapter 1, that's probably the most important thing here when we're talking about the interpersonal process is this quote on page 33. So he's talking about how this can feel like a tall order. It can feel like a lot of pressure. It can feel like you have to kind of catch everything. The most helpful aspect about the interpersonal process is that you actually don't. You don't have to capture everything. You don't have to be perfect. All you have to be is human and engage intentionally in the relationship. And so the most important thing is that you can be yourselves. And so he says, in closing, new therapists are encouraged to be themselves with clients rather than trying to fulfill the role of a therapist. Perhaps Kant says it best. When all is said and done, nothing in our work may be more important than our willingness to bring as much of ourselves as possible to the therapeutic session. One of the great satisfactions of this work comes at the moment that students realize that when they enter the consulting room, they don't have to don a therapist's mask, a therapist's voice, a therapist's posture, and a therapist's vocabulary. They can discard those accoutrements because they have much, much more than that to give their clients. What you have to give your clients is yourself. One of the fun things about this class, one of the challenging things as a teacher, this is one of the aspects of being a therapist, is that it calls a great personal accountability. One of the things I've been reflecting on the class and some of the feedback that I've received, and I think we've been going a little bit fast. And I think part of that is because there's so much here. There's so much beauty, there's so much depth that we can explore, that there's this part of me that just wants to give it, like, all of it to you guys, and wants to make sure that, like, you guys don't miss anything that's important, that's helpful, that wants to nail it down, that wants to be a good professor, that wants to make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. But that in itself is a problematic interpersonal process, right? So you guys will see my more helpful reparative interpersonal processes in the way that I interact with you as a class, and hopefully the resolution of those. It's one of the most important things as a therapist is this self-awareness. And so I'm certainly going to try here today a little bit more, to go a little bit slower, to be a little bit more intentional, hopefully to say less, or say more in less. Because what I hope is to really involve you guys in this class, not simply as students who have to write down everything and understand every single point and memorize the material, but as collaborators, like we're talking about. I want you guys to be participating in this learning process. And so, part of that is me realizing, right, part of my problematic interpersonal process is I have to do it all, I have to do it perfectly, I have to take responsibility, for you guys learning everything, right? This is a problematic interpersonal process that we can employ with our clients, right? Is that I have to be the best therapist, I have to say the right thing, I have to hit the right notes, right? We talk about one of the issues that makes it difficult to be a therapist is performance anxieties, right? So the important thing is to become aware, to let go of that self-monitoring, and to allow ourselves to be ourselves. And in collaboration, what collaboration does is it gives both parties the opportunity to be active participants, first of all. So it actually welcomes your engagement. But the second thing that occurs in that is that it actually gives both people responsibility for the interaction, right? So you guys share responsibility for your education and your learning, just like your clients will share responsibility for the work that they do in session. And I think when we can act out those helpful interpersonal processes, we experience collaboration, which is much more meaningful for all people involved, which gives us the opportunity to make mistakes and have misses. Because it says this relationship We're going to create the frame and the parameters of this relationship to be self-correcting. The only reason that this relationship could be self-correcting is if both sides are open to feedback and both sides feel that their feedback is important and valuable. So know that this class is aimed at helping you to learn how can you be yourself, but also to be yourself in a helpful way. That you do have to show up in a particular way as a therapist. You have to understand the frame and your parameters. But if being a therapist trumps being yourself, you're not going to be a very good therapist. Or you'll be a therapist that feels really good in the therapy session, but maybe everything falls apart or feels very disconnected outside the session. What leads so often to our pain, our difficulty, is that we've learned very effective ways to distort reality so that we can live in it more easily. And our task with our clients is to say, in effect, I want to be in reality with you here and now. We don't have to distort reality to make it more livable. We can actually embrace our finitude, embrace our limitations as a person. And when we embrace our limitations, that's when meaning occurs, right? Because we're not going to live forever. We're not going to be perfect. It's an impossible task. But we can be finite and limited and still helpful. And so that's really what I hope you guys can really learn about empathy today, is that empathy is one of the really important frames for empathy is embracing that we can't know perfectly what someone's thinking, what someone's feeling, what someone's experiencing, what a certain thing meant to someone. And so because of that, we have to ask. And I think what being a good therapist is, in a certain fundamental way, it's about learning to ask questions that are helpful. It's not about asking the right question, because at any point in time, there's a million right questions to ask, and there is no fundamental right question. One of the things that I was amazed with when I was in my training in grad school here at Franciscan, when my teachers would do role plays or when we would watch tapes of expert therapists, I kind of had this sense that the therapist was like this guru. And because I would see the therapist, Father Gregoire's, he teaches at the he teaches some classes in the counseling program. If you guys do the counseling program, I really suggest you guys take a class with Father Gregoire. I also suggest joining him in his home country, Mauritius, which is a small island country off the east coast of Madagascar in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Father Gregoire, he's an amazing priest. He's an amazing therapist. But I was in his class, and you know, he did some live therapy sessions with one of the students. And I was kind of just sitting there like, oh my gosh, like, he's a guru. Like, he knows how to go here, and that makes the client go there, and then how to go there. And he knows how to get the client to go to their like core central issue. But as I practiced therapy, and as I kind of started getting into it, there's a part of me, this part of me probably comes up a lot in class too, that like wants to be the guru, that wants to be the therapist that kind of knows like, what's the thing that I need to say here to like connect, right, to be helpful. But I started to realize that our clients know where to go on their own. Typically, they've just never had the permission to do so. So being a therapist is about knowing how to effectively create the permission for the clients to go there in a way that they haven't been allowed to go there before. That's the corrective emotional experience. Now, what going there means is going to be different for each client. And that's client response specificity. That's why we have to have some sense for what's going on in the session. But Carl Rogers said, if we create the right conditions for therapy, it'll happen all on its own, right? He said that humans are naturally self-actualizing. We all have a tendency to kind of reach health on our own, but when things get in the way, then we get more concerned with fixing those problems, like those interpersonal defenses. And so his style of therapy was very non-directive, which we talked about a little bit in the last class, and we'll talk a little bit here today as we get started. He pretty much said, if we create an environment where there's empathy, where we're able to accurately understand and communicate what somebody's experiencing, where we're unconditionally valuing the person, that doesn't mean accepting all their behaviors, but we're unconditionally valuing the person as good and worthy of love, and we are being congruent, we're being genuine, we're acting as we really are. We're not fake, we're not putting on a mask, as we talked about. Then the client will naturally come to the answers on their own. Now, I think that attitude is right. I think the assumption that if we create the right environment, the client will come to the answers on their own. But the issue with that, and this issue is addressed in the interpersonal process by client response specificity, as well as the active versus directive or non-directive stance. It's true that we have to create the conditions for change, but the conditions for change they are not a one-size-fits-all condition. Some individuals will need a more directive. Some individuals will actually really benefit from advice, from you saying, hey, I think you should probably break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, right? Some individuals would really benefit. They might come in and say, what should I do? Should I break up with my girlfriend and my boyfriend? And we don't want to say, oh no, sorry, I'm not going to make that decision for you. I'm a therapist. But we want to say, okay, we're going to identify the core issue, and then we're going to explore it. That's kind of the nature of what we do over and over and over and over and over again. Identify what's going on, and that's to say we're creating a safe haven emotionally for the client. And secondly, explore what's going on in greater detail. That's creating a safe base from which to go out. So the interpersonal process, that client response specificity is about conceptualizing and understanding what is the relational experience that this person needs in order to change in the way that they want. And our role is to create those conditions. We fail to create those conditions when we are wrapped up in our own faulty processes. And so that's why doing our own work, self-monitoring, having great supervision is so important. So let's pick up, again, for anybody who wasn't here, our normal next week, what we'll be doing on Tuesday is we will be doing some practice in class. And so you guys will pair up with each other and practice your listening skills and reflecting skills. There's a PDF in the files called How to Be a Great Listener. And I want you guys to read that. Your assignment is to read that PDF for Tuesday's class. Our normal Tuesday quiz at 9 a.m. will be on Thursday. So our normal Tuesday quiz will be next Thursday on Chapter 3, Honoring Resistance, and we will go over. So there's a slight adjustment in our class schedule. What I was planning on doing was going through Chapter 3 totally next week, and then the following week having 2 classes that are just kind of open for practice, but we're just going to split that. So next Tuesday is going to be practice, next Thursday is going to be lecture, and then the following Tuesday will be continued lecture on honoring resistance, and then the following Thursday will be continued practice. So I think it's more natural to spread that out a little bit more. Like I said, that file is on the Canvas page. Secondly, I would like to give a little bit of a demonstration of what some of this listening, what some of this work looks like together. So I'm wondering if anybody would even consider coming in front of the class and being an example as I would work with you. Now, this doesn't have to be for a core central emotional problem. This is not the time to say, oh, I'm going to take advantage of therapy and work out all my stuff with John Paul. But it is a time to say, hey, let's sit together in front of the class, fully acknowledging that I'm your teacher and your classmates are here, and let's see if we can actually give you all an experience of what this actually practically looks like, because this is all very theoretical. As long as it stays theoretical, it'll come in one ear and eventually kind of drift out the other. So you're not being put on the spot right now, but I'm wondering if you could raise your hand if you would be willing to even consider being a practice client in class. Anybody? Raise them up high if anybody would even be willing to consider. Okay, cool. My hope in that exploration, like I said, here's the thing. There's two different types of vulnerability, I think, that I've come to understand. And I think typically we understand that vulnerability means the first thing. And we think that vulnerability is the vulnerability of content, right? We're thinking about informational vulnerability, right? And this would be saying things like, oh, I'm really more self-conscious than I look, right? Or, oh, this is actually part of my family history. Or, oh, this is something that I'm embarrassed about from my past, right? We feel vulnerable when we share bits of information about ourselves. And I think that's typically what we think of vulnerability. But the second, and I think more important, more valuable aspect of vulnerability is experiential vulnerability. This happens, right, when we give a presentation. This happens when we stand up in front of a crowd. This happens in therapy. This happens maybe perhaps during an exam or during a test or during a paper. But maybe not so much during a paper, but experiential vulnerability is when we feel vulnerable because we are doing something that feels challenging, or we are doing a process, we are involved in a process, and we feel like because we're doing something new, that process might feel difficult. So although I do not expect if you guys were to volunteer, one, maybe two students, my hope is to kind of half the class all give a demonstration with maybe one or two students. And then the second half of the class, you guys will practice with each other, just practicing listening skills. My hope is to demonstrate what the interpersonal process actually looks like when you're working together. It's not to land some big, deep emotional punches and get the waterworks or whatever it is. Our goal as therapists isn't to make people cry, and we need to remember that. We need to let our clients know that. Although tears oftentimes can be helpful, that's not the goal of therapy. But I do want to give you all the opportunity to see and feel what it might look like, and then to explore that together as a class. So yeah, we will of those who are kind of possible willing participants, we'll pick on Thursday. But think about something that you would be willing to talk about. It doesn't have to be something crazy deep. But what we will really be exploring is, we'll be doing a lot of process work in the here and now. Exploring even probably, well, what's it like for you to come up in front of the class and sit here, right? That's what process work is about. The key to process is the belief that there's nothing more important for us to talk about than what's happening in our relationship. There's nothing more important to talk about than what's happening in our relationship. Because if what's happening in our relationship doesn't feel good or safe, everything else is going to be funneled through that. Are there any questions about that? Excellent. So let us pick up with, we covered issues of the directive style. And the key issue with the directive style, we'll just breeze through the directive style. Is that it does not build a sense of autonomy and self-reliance. And it also does not give the client an experience of authentic reciprocity where they have a sense of ownership of their life and of their experience. when we create a directive relationship, oftentimes we actually bring in an unwanted hierarchy structure between somebody who knows what's going on, the therapist, and somebody who doesn't. And oftentimes that is actually the very process that leads to issues from the beginning. That this person experiences relationships repeatedly where they don't have space, they don't have authority, they don't have ownership. This is especially difficult for compliant individuals, people who have learned that the way that you experience healthy relationships is just to agree and go along with what the other person is saying or what the other person wants you to do. When that happens, the sense of personal power is decreased, and it really brings a sense of shame. And it can bring a sense of shame in two ways. One, just that shame of not having autonomy. But the second is the shame and the frustration that can occur when the therapist is telling them to do something and they have a hard time doing it. It can create an unwanted pressure or an expectation that the client has to perform for the therapist, or that the client has to do what the therapist wants. And if they don't, that's why they're still depressed. That's why they're still struggling, which is not actually true. The reason that they're still depressed for a compliant client is that they aren't actually exercising their human freedom of autonomy and dignity. They are treating themselves as a second-class citizen. So then the issues with the non-directive style. This is on page 41. So it's frustrating to clients. Clients oftentimes when they come into therapy, they don't know what's wrong. They don't know what they need. So when a client brings something up and you say, "Oh, I can't help you here," what it feels like to the client is, I'm frustrated, I need help, I'm asking for help, and you're just kind of moving away from it. You're not stepping in and helping me. That creates a greater frustration, which creates a greater anxiety, which creates a greater bid and ask for help, and ultimately leaves the client in this same escalating frustration with the therapist, which is a lot of times what will lead a client to drop out. So they experience the therapist as evasive, as getting away from what their core need is. And a second really important point here is that clients oftentimes have been punished for autonomy. So oftentimes clients in their families of origin, in their relationships, if they were actually to exhibit strength, if they were actually going to say what they wanted to do, if they were going to share their opinion on something, it's don't speak unless spoken to. Your opinion doesn't matter. You have to be thoughtful for what other people want to do. You have to take one for the team, right? There can be a communication in which loving somebody else means doing whatever they want. And so when we ask clients, okay, do what you want, we're creating this condition where they're hearing us say, hey, do what you want, but what they're experiencing inside is a part of them, an internal working model that says, when I am strong, I'm punished. When I am intentional about what I want, I get crushed. And so as always, and in this, with the directive and the non-directive styles, our goal is to create an active stance. An active stance that is showing that we are present and we're helpful. We're not being overly passive, we're not being overly directive. The balance is the golden mean in the middle. It's the virtue. It's the point that's between two opposing opposites. An opposite of excess and not an opposite of deficit. Too much and too little. So what we are seeking is to have an active stance, which is the Goldilocks, just right. And the way we do this It's the solution is collaboration. And in collaboration, in the beginning of our work together, we're showing this collaboration in two ways. It is important for us to give an experience of collaboration, but we do need to say it. So we want to give clients explicit permission, spoken permission to pursue what they want, and then we want to enthusiastically join in. When we do this, this is the experience of welcoming rather than just saying. It's not enough to just tell them, oh, let's talk about what you want to talk about. Oftentimes what might happen is you might say, well, let's talk about what's most important to you. And somebody might say, well, honestly, I don't know whether I should date this person or this person. I like this person, but I'm having a lot of issues with this person. And then we say, well, okay, relationship stuff is valuable, but what's really bringing you in? So on the one hand, we're giving them permission, we're welcoming them in, we're saying what's important to you, and then we're backtracking. Behaviorally, verbally we're saying, tell me what you want to talk about. Behaviorally we're saying that's not important. So what we want to do is we want to give spoken permission and then enthusiastically join in, right? So what do you want to talk about today? Oh, I'm having a lot of tension in this relationship. I don't know whether I should date this person or not. Great, that's an awesome place to start. Let's see if we can understand you, help you understand a little bit with a little bit more clarity what's happening for you, and maybe we can help you navigate this situation. As we're talking about this situation with this relationship between you and this person, I'd like for us to explore too, how might this pattern be showing up here that's not super helpful for you? Oftentimes when we have issues in one relationship, we have relationship issues in a lot of other places. And so absolutely, let's jump in to this issue of should you date this person or not. But let's do so with the mindset that this probably fits into a bigger picture as well. And that is that experience of collaboration. So what happens in this active stance? What are some ways that we can communicate that? We are going to provide feedback about patterns, kind of sharing the patterns that we're seeing. We're going to try to help the individual consider alternatives, alternative ways of thinking, alternative possibilities, alternative perspectives. We're not saying you shouldn't think about that way, but we're saying like one thing that can be really valuable when someone says, they were just, this person was just so rude to me. A helpful thing might be to say, what do you think was going on in their head? Like if you were going to send a spy over to see what was happening interiorly for them, what do you think was going on in that moment? And what you're doing is you're helping the client to decentralize from the overwhelm of their emotion and kind of take a different perspective. You're also working to provide empathy and validation. We're saying, hey, yeah, these feelings are worth being here. You deserve attention and respect here. We're giving interpersonal feedback. That's to say, we are letting the client know how their relational patterns are showing up. And then we are working in the process, in the here and now. We can make comments that say, hey, let's explore like what's happening in the here and now. These are all ways that we can practice that collaboration and welcome into dialogue. So that's providing feedback about the patterns we're seeing, considering other people's perspective, or just considering alternative perspectives, providing empathy and validation, giving that interpersonal feedback, and talking in the process about the here and now. These are all ways that we can exhibit this active stance. And so it's important when we begin that from the very beginning of our work together, we are creating this collaboration in the very first session. So it begins with the initial interview. Now, this class, we are not going to talk at length about things relating to confidentiality or kind of specific intakes. You guys will learn, if you guys are going on to counseling, you guys will learn about all that stuff. You'll get bored of it real quick. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about those issues. Although they are very valuable, they are important, but I think they'll get covered sufficiently in other classes. But one of the keys in this first interaction is role induction. And what role induction is that we are providing education on the general process. So we're filling the client in on what they can expect for that first interview, and what they can expect about the therapeutic process, because many clients don't really know what to expect. They don't know what therapy looks like. And then secondly, we're going to give them guidelines and direction. So the first is education about the therapy process in general. And then the second is education about what the first session will look like. So we want to give clients a chance to know, hey, okay, for this first session, here's a little bit about the therapy process, how we might work together, blah, blah, blah. You have a little spiel. The second part is going to be, and this is what our session today is going to be like. I'd like to get a little bit of a better understanding for why you're coming into therapy. I'd like to get an understanding for what you see as the foundational issue. I'd like to understand what goals you might have. And I'd especially like to understand, what fears or hesitations that you might have that might come into therapy with you. And in this whole process, we're trying to create a warm and authentic presence. A presence that says, I'm really here, I really care. We want to create a climate in which they feel somewhat comfortable. We do this in, especially in open-ended questions. A lot of clients don't really know why they're coming in. We said this before. And so, again, we see this pattern. What we're doing is we're asking, what's really wrong? What are you really here for? And then we're joining in. This is the thing that we're going to do over and over again. What's wrong? What's happening for you in life? And then we join in exploring that. We really want to take that first session and introduce this sense of curiosity of like, okay, a lot of people are like, oh, I don't know what my goals are. I don't know what I want. Okay, well, tell me a little bit about that. We actually want to jump in, right? That's a good place to start. Wow, you're here at therapy because you're having a lot of difficulties in your life, and yet you don't know where to begin. Do you experience this in other areas of your life where you don't really know where to get started, where you don't really know what to begin with? Again, we are identifying and then we are exploring. And so there's 3 situations that are especially difficult for the first. There's 3 situations that are especially difficult for us to create this collaboration. The first is if there's a previous interview. So if the intake is done with another therapist, or there's an intake, somebody who kind of does the intakes for you, so you don't really have that first control over the interactions. The second is that the supervisor's presence is felt. And then the third is that there's conflicts over initiating for the client. When there's a previous interview, when somebody else does that first session, when somebody else does that intake, what can happen is that people can experience triangulation. And who can tell me what triangulation is? Yeah, Nick.
I think it kind of like, from what I remember from the book, I think it's when you start here and you get somewhere, and you get somewhere else, and then it comes back to the beginning because like, it doesn't really work. I don't know, something like that.
Not quite. Not quite. Triangulation is about relationships. Yeah, Becca.
It's when like one person does the initial interview and it's not the same person as the client, so it's kind of bringing in another person.
Yeah.
It's like kind of feels like a miscommunication maybe on the client's
Mm-hmm.
side because they don't know like what the two like therapist or supervisor like
Yeah.
talked about.
Yeah, it creates a relationship between 3 parties instead of 2. But what's the kind of prototypical, basic situation in which triangulation usually emerges?
Usually it's like in your family, like
Mm-hmm.
your parents usually like with their marriage,
Mm-hmm.
a third party will get involved, like
Yes.
maybe the child will as like the peacemaker.
Yes.
and stuff like that.
Exactly. And so this is triangulation, right? You have mom and you have dad, right? And they have a relationship here. And what happens inevitably in relationships? What comes up? Who said it? Problems, right? So then you got these problems that are coming up between mom and dad. This is unstable. Murray Bowen, who was a family therapist, a systems therapist, said the most unstable relationship is a relationship between 2 people. Because if something breaks here, where's the fallback? There is none, right? If something breaks here, that the very relationship breaks. And so this causes anxiety in the relationship. And so the easiest and most common way for that anxiety to get reduced in the relationship when mom and dad are having issues with each other is what?
Another person.
Another person gets involved. Could be a friend, could be another family member. Oftentimes it's the child, right? So then you have C, right? The child, who has no business whatsoever being in this relationship. But all of a sudden, mom says, I don't really want to talk about this with dad. I'm gonna reduce that anxiety, but I'm gonna tell my child all about the issues with dad, right? And so now there's a triangle. This is much more stable, but it's much more problematic. Yeah.
So like that at the end is going to lead to like the child having distorted views of the other opposite party. That like if the mom's talking to the child
Yes.
about the dad, the child's going to grow up hating the dad.
Exactly, and that's what happens, right? The anxiety between mom and dad gets transferred onto 2 other points. The anxiety between mom and dad is now, actually 3 total. The anxiety between mom and dad is now stabilized by anxiety being between mom and dad, anxiety being distributed about mom and dad between mom and child, and anxiety is getting distributed between child and dad now. So the issue with this is that it's very, very stable because one of these breaks and it's still there. The other breaks and it's still there. The other breaks and it's still there. But the issue is that if the anxiety is distributed between mom and dad and kid and dad, what doesn't happen between mom and dad? Communication. They never figure out their shit. They never figure out the problem. They never take care of business, right? And so when this happens for a client over and over and over again, all of a sudden, the client comes in, does an interview with somebody, and then now you're in a relationship with them, and they're saying like, wait, are you guys going to be talking about me? Is this a relationship between me and them? Is it a relationship between me and you? Is it a relationship between all 3 of these? So when there's a previous interview, this doesn't always happen, but it happens, it can happen. We want to create a relationship that's based on a stable dyad between the client and the therapist. Again, what do we want to do? What are the 2 things that we want to do? We want to bring up what's happening, we want to identify it, and then we want to explore it together. And essentially that's to say, hey, I have an intake, from this therapist, and I'm grateful for the information that they shared. What I want you to know is that going out, from here out, this is just going to be between me and you. And I want our relationship to be something that starts fresh and something that's organic. We don't have to you can know that like what's going to happen here is between me and you. That's very important. The second issue occurs when the supervisor's presence is felt. And this can happen because the therapist makes that present or the client makes it present. And this might happen, there's two ways that the therapist can make the supervisor's presence felt. The first is if the therapist is kind of constantly saying something like, oh, I'll have to check with my supervisor about that. Client has an issue, oh, I'll have to check with my supervisor about that. Now, of course, there are some situations where that's actually relevant and important to do. But they're usually, I think, the exceptions. The second way, so the first is when it's said overtly, explicitly by the therapist. The second way is when, what is one of the things that creates performance anxieties in the therapist? What's happening in here? What's my supervisor going to say, right? So I'm sitting here with a client, and they say, oh, you know, I experienced abuse when I was younger. And I'm thinking, what's my supervisor going to say? How would my supervisor want me to react? What would my supervisor say to him? Do I need to report this? Is my supervisor going to say that I'm doing this the wrong way? And then, right, we become centralized in ourselves, we lose contact with the client, and we're not able, our focus shifts from helping the client to being self-occupied. So part of the skill is to learn that my relationship to my supervisor is that after session, I bring things to them. But my supervisor doesn't have to be in the room with me. The other aspect is when the client brings things up. So the client can bring things up for a lot of reasons. One of the things you guys will do is you guys will record sessions with your clients, and then you'll watch them with your supervisors. So the client might have, now all of that is with permission of the client. They've signed paperwork, they've said they're okay with it, but they still might have some ambivalence or not be sure. So one of the things that you're going to see is they will say things like, oh, well, I'm not, like, I'm being recorded, so I don't know if I should be honest, all these things. What that's helpful for is what we want to do is we want to explore the internal working models that those are revealing. Someone's saying, well, I'm a little bit nervous about being recorded. You can say, yeah, it's pretty common that people feel a little bit nervous. What I want you to know is that per our agreement that's written down, this contract, none of this will be shared. But I'm curious, and then we explore internal working models. What are you scared of that the supervisor might think? Maybe they'll think I'm dumb. That tells you something about their internal working models. Maybe they'll think I'm a know-it-all. That tells you something about their internal working models. Maybe they judge me. That tells you something about their working models. So you want to explore that. The second thing that comes up with the clients might bring up is that the client says, oh, well, maybe you don't really know what you're doing. Maybe I'm just like a test dummy, right? Maybe this is just, you know, practice for you. And essentially what they're saying is, I don't know if you're actually competent, if you can actually help me. When that comes up, we want to face it head on. We want to say, hey, you know, it makes sense to me that you might be a little bit nervous because I'm a beginning therapist. That's okay. Can we talk about what you might feel nervous about? What might go wrong here if I'm a beginning therapist? It's going to take us to the root of the issue again, right? It's going to reveal those internal working models. We identify and we explore. We identify and we explore. The third issue is when the client has been parentified. And what parentified means is that the client has been made to take on the role of taking care of their parents. Could have been in a kind of triangulatory situation. But over and over again, the client has found themselves in the role of caregiving for their client. And if the client has found themselves in the role of caregiving for their parent, and they know that you have a supervisor that's watching this tape or monitoring their treatment, what might they try to do?
Make the therapist look good by sort of like acting as if progress is happening.
Exactly, right? I want to make mom proud. I want to make dad proud. That can essentially happen in the therapeutic session by, oh, the client can kind of, again, this is a performance. I'm going to show up. I'm going to try really hard to make progress. I'm going to show that you're a really good therapist. because the client has learned in their attachment, their internal working models, that in order for me to receive the care that I need to take care of my caregiver. If I don't take care of my caregiver goes away. Yeah, Mina.
Is it more of an ethical thing that the client has to know there's a supervisor?
The client does have to know that there's a supervisor, yes. But past informing the client that you're under supervision, we shouldn't be bringing it up in session. So this is a key to what we do in therapy. We're not making things bigger than they are. We're not making things smaller than they are. We're naming them for what they are, and then we're moving forward with it. And I think one of the fourth issues that can come up, and this can be especially relevant if you're working with college kids, is my parents are paying for therapy, right? So then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, well, I have to do really good in therapy because mom or dad is paying for it, and maybe they're reluctant to pay for it. Maybe they feel like, well, I'll pay for it, but only if things really change. And what happens in that situation, again, is a sense of triangulation. I'm sitting here with my client, but there's a third person in the room, right? I'm sitting here with my client, but dad is constantly looking over the shoulder of the client. Now, dad's not physically in the room, but emotionally and relationally, dad is in the room. Because the client, in the same way that my therapist would be in the room if I'm constantly self-monitoring, my supervisor, if I'm constantly self-monitoring, my client might experience their parents in the room as having these expectations and demands. Again, when these things come up, we name them and we explore them. And then the final issue is, and we've spoken of this a little bit, is when clients have issues over initiating. So when we ask that question, where should we begin? With certain clients, we are inadvertently exposing that client to the very central issue that brings them in. We spoke about this a moment ago. I don't know where to begin. What we want to do in that situation is make a process comment to identify and explore. We might say something like, okay, because we'll pick up on that anxiety. When you ask someone, where should we begin? You'll either see them jump for something, and you'll feel it. You'll feel like, maybe that was a quick jump to something that's an interesting thing to jump through. We of course want to explore that. Or people will just kind of be like deer in the headlights. And so we're inadvertently exposing this person to a high amount of anxiety, and we want to make a process comment to say, hey, let's explore this together. Hey, I just asked you, where should we begin? But I notice and I kind of feel in myself almost a bit of anxiety that's really showing up in the room. I'm wondering, what happens for you when I ask that question? Where does that question take you? Because it feels almost like there's a tremendous amount of pressure. And then that becomes a huge part of your treatment goal. Saying like, hey, let's help you to be confident in choosing where to begin. Over and over again, we're seeking to understand what's happening for this client in this moment. We're identifying and exploring. And so we'll shift into empathic understanding. Right, this is the central piece of our working alliance. And so what empathy is the ability to repeatedly identify and discern what is central and understand what is most important in what the client has just said to us. It's this sense of warmth and concern, but the key is that it behaviorally demonstrates, show, don't tell, it behaviorally demonstrates that we get the client. As you guys begin in your work as therapists, I want to encourage you to avoid saying things like, I understand. I get that. I totally know what you're talking about. When we say those things, what we're saying is, in my head, I understand what you're saying from my perspective. But if we say that without actually verifying what we're understanding the client to say, we don't know what they're saying. We can lean back on this sense of I understand when we feel uncomfortable or when we really want to show understanding. We say it. But clients believe actions much more than they understand words. And so empathy is something that's highly discriminatory. And when we say highly discriminatory, when we say highly discriminatory, what we mean is that it's specific, it's clear what we mean, what we don't. It's not broad, it's not general, it's specific. When we are working to be empathic, we are trying to nail it on the head what the client is saying. And if we don't know, if we don't understand, if we can't nail it on the head, you ask. You say, oh, you just said that, but I don't think I understood that the way that I wanted to. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And so we are understanding the subjective experience is key. And then, well, that is not a B. We are understanding, and then we are communicating. I have to understand in my head what you're saying, but then the key to empathy is not feeling with the client. It's articulating well that you feel with the client. So could somebody say something to me that's, I don't know, an emotional statement, something that's important? I'll give you guys an example of kind of both sides of this. What's something you might say to a therapist that you might want to receive empathy for? Yeah.
I just lost a really important family member close to me like 2 weeks ago.
Tell me what it was like for you to lose that person.
Well, I've grown up with that person my whole life and feel like they've been guiding me through everything. So once they were gone, it was tough to see them go because I just feel lost now.
You knew this person so well and they were a central part of your life. And now that they're gone, you feel like a part of you's missing, like a part of your life has fallen apart. Now that's very different than saying, I understand. I hear you. Oh, I get that. It's different than saying, grief's so hard, I know exactly what you mean. We are reflecting back with intention what the client is saying. Empathy is not being nice. It's being specific. It's being intentional. Empathy is about attending to what is said and then accurately reflecting that back. If we are nice, our therapist will feel like, well, they were a really nice person. He was a really nice guy. But I don't think he really understood me. We want to give the experience of understanding by understanding and then by communicating that we understand. And so clients oftentimes don't feel understood. If they felt understood, they probably wouldn't be coming to therapy. Oftentimes, their experience was repeatedly and systematically invalidated. There's some examples in the book of ways that they say this. One of the things that I think sticks out to me was, I'm cold. A parent kind of saying to a kid, I'm cold, put on a coat. Right? Kid saying, oh, I'm really sad that I'm really sad that my toy broke. Get over it. It's just a toy. Oh, I'm really sad that I missed the team. There'll be more teams next year, right? Oh, I'm really bummed that I got a B instead of an A. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. You need to have more realistic standards for yourself, right? When this happens repeatedly and systematically, individuals feel crazy because what they're experiencing on the inside is denied on the outside. And when this happens over and over again, it leaves clients not understanding what really happened. You'll work with a lot of people and you'll come to see that even though they tell you something horrific and terrible and really painful, they don't know what happened. And it's not strictly because they weren't able to process it, it's because they have learned you are not allowed to trust your perception. You have to trust mom's perception. You have to trust dad's perception. You have to trust sister or brother's perception. You have to trust teacher's perception. And when they no longer trust perceptions of what's happening, they don't know how to get out of an unsafe situation. If people are repeatedly invalidated for their feeling like this feels bad, and then they're in a dangerous situation and they feel this feels bad, the cognitions that go through their head oftentimes are, it's probably not that big of a deal. You're probably just overreacting. You're probably you shouldn't make that person feel uncomfortable by leaving, or you shouldn't say something. You shouldn't upset other people, and that leads people to vulnerability. When individuals are not able to trust their own instincts for what is safe and unsafe, they are vulnerable to be getting hurt, right? Because the fire alarm goes off, and they say, batteries are probably dead. Fire alarm's probably broken. And most of the time it's actually because there's a fire. But repeatedly throughout their life, there's been a fire, and they've said, Mom, Dad, there's a fire. And they've been told, that's not a fire. Mom, Dad, there's a fire. It's not a fire. So then they see a fire, and they go, it's not a fire. And then that fire erupts. And so when we see those things, we say them, right? We say, wow, you were really feeling scared. That felt like a really dangerous situation for you. I think your perception was right on. I think you saw that situation was scary. I think you were right. But it sounds like you weren't able to trust that. Identify and explore. And so when we communicate our understanding, we do it overtly and specifically. When we provide empathy, it's a little bit more like an accurate interpretation or a creative reframing. We're trying to take the client's words and understand, okay, what are these words? There is a simple reflection, right? And this can be a very effective tool in therapy. Somebody says, yeah, I'm just feeling sad. And they kind of drift off. A simple reflection is, oh, you're feeling sad. And that's actually a very, very effective intervention. But if all we do is that, if all we do is parrot back and forth what they're saying, they're going to feel frustrated. And sometimes, even when you're providing accurate empathy, people will say, you're just saying what I said back to you. And so then we can explore, oh, right, what's going on in the process? I'm trying to understand you, and I try to do that by reflecting. I can see that's bothering you. What happens for you when I try to capture your emotions and share them to you? And, oh, well, I think it's phony. And then you explore. Tell me about this feeling of phoniness. When have you experienced this before? Because it seems like it's coming up right now. And to be honest, I actually genuinely want to understand you. But I can see that something's getting in the way of that. You identify and explore. Again, we're not saying I understand. We're acting it out. We're showing. And so how do we do this? How do we do this when the client is saying things over and over and so many different things and so many different stories? And the key is that recurrent themes help us to understand. You are listening for patterns, and the patterns will show up. You don't have to know what each pattern is, but when you see a pattern and you think it might be there, you kind of just like tuck it in your back pocket, right? And then when you see that pattern coming up and up and up and up and up, you name it. And so when we do this, we help clients understand what their own story is. We help clients come to terms with what actually happened. And the second thing that we do is that it helps us and the client to collaboratively develop a treatment focus. Like I said, oftentimes when people come into therapy, they aren't quite sure exactly what they want. But if we can effectively identify patterns that come up over and over and over again, then we can kind of say, wow, this pattern seems to be coming up a lot. Maybe that's something that we could help you out with. And so we are together identifying a deeper pattern, a deeper problem, and using that as a focus for treatment. And when we do this, when we identify the patterns, we are supporting their initiative. The client is actually joining and they feel good about participating in therapy. We are getting at the core message of their experience. And it helps develop insight. Insight is not the goal of therapy. But insight is helpful. It's a helpful tool. So the three main patterns that you guys are going to be listening for is relational themes, pathogenic beliefs, and affective themes or emotional themes. There are three spheres of relational themes. Can anybody tell me what these spheres are? We've talked about them a couple times. The three spheres of repetitive relational themes. The three areas that we're exploring relational themes with the client.
It's like the interactions with day-to-day people.
Mm-hmm.
It's the family interactions.
Yes.
And the here and now with it.
Yes, exactly. Daily interactions, developmental interactions, and here and now interactions. We do this simply by saying, okay, somebody's coming up with the issue with the relationship. Oh, it sounds like you're experiencing a lot of indecision right now. You don't know what to do. That could be a daily interaction. You're going to hear later, most likely, wow, it sounds like you got conflicting messages from mom and dad. You just reflect this back. It sounds like you got conflicting messages from mom and dad. Sometimes it seemed like they wanted you to succeed. Sometimes it seemed like they were jealous. Sometimes they told you that you didn't have to take responsibility for other people. And then sometimes when you were 5 years old, they left you at home with your younger brothers and sisters, which were ages 2 and 1, right? So you are identifying these, and then here now, okay, I'm getting a sense that you're unsure whether I can actually take care of you. Sometimes by the comments that you make, it feels like you're trying to take care of me. Or you feel like if you were actually going to share what you felt, it might be too much for me to bear. That you might burden me with emotions and I might disappear. So when we identify these patterns in their daily life, in the developmental relationships that they've experienced, and in the here and now, we are helping the clients develop a coherent narrative for their lives while also clarifying a treatment focus. Our conceptualization is ongoing, and so is our treatment plan. We're kind of reformulating the treatment plan. Now, we're going to have a treatment plan, but we're reformulating treatment plan in each session as we're coming more and more to understand what the core themes are in the client. So the second is the pathogenic beliefs. And these are cognitions or thoughts. We spoke on this a little bit at the end of our last class. Our relational patterns are linked to belief structures. Our relational patterns are linked to what we think. Other people should have authority. I should always have the authority in relationships. I should be in complete control of the people in the relationships in my life. Other people should be able to control me. Yes?
Relational patterns are linked to what?
Relational patterns are linked to faulty beliefs or cognitions. And so there's what's called pathogenic beliefs. And a pathogenic belief is a faulty and symptom-engendering belief that's learned from these repetitive interactions that are very emotionally charged that we have with attachment figures. And then these pathogenic beliefs developed into fixed structures that create and sustain maladaptive relationships. So they're learned in repetitive interactions that are emotionally laden, that are emotionally charged with attachment figures, and then they create and they sustain. It's a reciprocal relationship, the difficult, problematic interactions that continue to occur. And so two of the biggest pathogenic beliefs that Albert Ellis named is the need to be loved and the need to be competent. And what happens, what's pathogenic about beliefs, is not that we all have a need to be loved, that's true, but it's the extremeness and the rigidity of these beliefs. So I must be accepted and loved by all people at all times. If not, it means I'm unlovable, right? Now, you don't need to be loved by everybody at all times. And the same thing with competence. We say, I must be competent in all situations at all times, or else I'm a failure. When we have pathogenic beliefs, which are rigid and extreme, they lead to extreme assumptions, and those extreme assumptions lead to extreme emotions. And it's actually not true, right? So we want to develop a greater flexibility. We want to be able to say, okay, well, I'd like to be loved by people, but I don't have to be loved by everybody at all times. If I have one or two people that really love me, that I know love me, that's good for me. That's actually true. That's actually accurate. And so the third is affective themes. And here we have what's called characterological affect. And what you'll see is these relational patterns come up over and over and over again. These cognitions will come up over and over again. And typically, people have a tendency to feel the same set of emotions over and over and over again. If you tend to feel a sense of sadness over and over again, you're probably going to develop depression. If you have a sense of worry, you'll probably develop anxiety. If you have a sense of shame, that's probably going to lead to depression. If you have a continued feeling of being out of control, you're probably going to develop obsession. If you have a continued emotional need to avoid shame, you're probably going to develop narcissistic defenses. And so the characterological affect is the central and repeated feelings that some people experience as a defining quality of their experience. And this is why it's so powerful to say, your life, your story, it sounds like it's from the very beginning been marked by a feeling of shame. And we are not being some guru who's saying the right thing. We are just reflecting what's actually been true. And that can be a very powerful thing. When we're able to empathize accurately, when we're able to accurately reflect what's actually happening for the client, it's very, very, very powerful, because these emotions and emotional reactions can happen so often, and they've been so denied, that all of a sudden, without saying I understand, you say, it seems like sadness has marked every turn of your life. It seems like every major experience in your life has been marked by a tremendous grief and a loss. It connects with what they've actually experienced their life to be, oftentimes in words that people have never been able to say to them. And it helps them know that they are known. And it helps them know and come to understand themselves. And it helps them to come to be less crazy. Because of course you're feeling grief if you have these losses. Of course you're feeling sad if everything has been marked by rejection. Of course you're feeling anxious and afraid and a need to control if, when you were young, you were put in a position of control over your family that was way above your pay grade. And these come to be a defining character, oftentimes, of people's experiences. And so again, we come back to performance anxieties. And we talked about this at the beginning, so we won't go too much into this point. Your performance anxieties are going to detract from your work. They make your working alliance hard. When we are excessively self-critical, it stops us in our place. And when we are anxious about performing, whatever our intervention is, it's going to come from a place of anxiety. That's most of the time what causes problems for us humans in the first place, is that the way people have reacted to us has been more motivated by their own anxiety than our well-being. And so we need to learn to reduce that inner chatter. We need to learn how to focus on the client. And then, of course, we need good supervisors. And I hope you guys can go on to become excellent therapists and good supervisors so you can provide this for generations of therapists, because we need supervisors who understand that at the core of anything in the helping profession is the person. And at the core of every person is relationship. That's inescapable. And if we understand that, whatever we do, it's gonna, if when we're in the process, whatever we do, it's gonna connect, if it's the accurate process. And if we're in the process and we miss the process, where in that process we apologize, we identify, we explore, and we move forward with an even stronger relationship. So the final point here as we wrap up is this empathic understanding is a precondition of change. This is the key, and this is, if you learn anything from this class, it's probably this: empathy before influence. People don't want to hear solutions until they feel that the person offering them the solution sufficiently understands the problem. So in all things that we want to do, we want to provide empathy. Oftentimes, clients can't care for themselves because they've never experienced someone who's cared for them. When we can care for the client effectively, they can learn to care for themselves. And so we do this when we recognize what's important to the client, express that we're genuinely concerned, and always communicate the unconditional dignity, worth, and respect. And so we will pick up with practice on Tuesday, and read the handout. It's a PDF. It's pretty short. It's like 15 pages, but it's like a handout. The text is really big, and there's some nice pictures in there of flowers and other therapeutic stuff you'd expect in a handout. So check that handout out, and I look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday.